Okay, so we're picking up our story where Shirley has, having gone to America, come back with her master's and came back here and did what?
So I
Part
worked
two.
in fundraising, actually, because having lived in the States, that's what people wanted to hire me for.
Because
I'd
they
had that
knew how to
experience.
fundraise, yeah.
Because the Americans know how to fundraise, and I'd done a bit of that. I mean, actually, in the States, if you can't fundraise, you would never end up as a CEO of a voluntary sector organisation. It just wouldn't happen. So it was good training, and I didn't particularly want to do it, but I worked at Muscular Dystrophy in fundraising for maybe a year and a half, and I had my first child and left because I thought, well, maybe I'll stay at home. I've got two daughters, yeah.
Olivia,
Grace and Olivia.
Grace and Olivia.
Yeah. And so at that time, I thought I didn't know what I was going to do, but within, honestly, it sounds awful, but within 3 months, I was working again, created a consultancy with a woman I knew who had been at the Foreign Office, and then she'd been in voluntary sector. We had complementary skills. It was the time that Thatcher was getting rid of a lot of, voluntary sector organisations were really in a mess at that time because the funding, so austerity and funding was going down. And so what we were able to do is look at, so what do you need to do within your organisation to create a sustainable charity, a sustainable voluntary sector. So between my experience and hers, we actually did quite a lot of work. And that was going really well and very flexible, and then we moved back to the States. Another job moved back to the States. So I've kind of been across both areas quite a lot.
Oh, that was your husband's job?
Yeah. But then, of course, by this time, I was pregnant with my second child, and of course we knew New York then. We had friends there. It seemed a lot less.
Get a green
and
card?
I got a green card.
Your daughter was born there?
And my second daughter was born there.
She
so
American
she was
or
also
is she
American.
British?
American.
She's
Both.
American?
She's got both
Got
passports.
both passports.
Both have both passports
Yeah.
now, yeah, which is a good thing.
Yeah, and then you came back. Now, what interested me, you got involved with learning disability, didn't you?
So I was, when I went back to work in New York, and I knew a few people, and I was recommended as CEO of the National Centre for Learning Disabilities, which was in New York. And I was not an expert in learning disabilities, learning differences, so dyslexia and other things. But what they wanted was a competent manager, if you like, a person who could run the organisation, because there were quite a lot of skilled people in the organisation on the subject matter. And that was a very interesting role, because it sort of got me into public policy in the States a bit. It was the start of an interesting journey. So I opened a Washington office for this particular organisation, because actually one of their missions was around policy and changing public policy in this area, and in order to do that you needed to be in the capital. And so we started looking at all the different ways to improve practice. So what you want at the end of the day, if you're like me and you go into social work or anything, you're there to make a difference. And so I've always believed that policy, if you could really change policy, that can make a difference, particularly in the States. So we put together a summit while I ran this organisation. And what that did was brought together, during the first Clinton administration, all the people in research around learning disabilities, the people who, the policymakers, the people on the ground, so people who are on practicing, and then we looked at, so what do consumers think? You know, what do mums and dads and other people think? And we created this event in Washington that was televised in the end, and it was the first term of Bill Clinton's presidency, so it was a great time to be in Washington, because they were really open to these things. We had Hillary Clinton
opening.
opening.
And they were pushing for healthcare, weren't they?
They were pushing for healthcare, and she was a big children's advocate. And what we were trying to do...
Sorry to interrupt you, did you meet a woman there called Donna Shalala?
I did meet Donna Shalala.
Yeah.
She spoke at this summit.
She's good, isn't she?
She's fantastic.
Yeah,
Takes a village to raise a child, Donna Shalala.
That's right, yeah.
She was Health and Human Services. Robert Reich spoke. He was running the...
Well, Shalala came over here, and met her through that really. But I thought, wow,
Yes,
what a very powerful lady.
She's amazing.
Yeah, and a great friend of the Clintons, of course.
Very good friend of the Clintons.
And why do you think it was the Clintons didn't do healthcare?
Oh, you know, it was 92, and being a sort of new person in Washington was quite interesting to watch it, because there were a lot of people who'd been there a long time, and I had a couple of senators on my board, the National Centre for Learning Disabilities, so who knew how Washington worked. And what they told me was that, when you're campaigning and you've got all your campaign people, you owe them and you bring them in and you give them jobs. So there were all these people from Arkansas in Washington who really didn't know how Washington works. And that's really tricky because it's a difficult city. And you need a few problem solvers, integrators, people who can, kick around a bit in Congress.
Or a civil service.
And it was very difficult in that first term. And one of the reasons they didn't get a lot of things done was because they had some great, nice people, but not the right people. They made good appointments in the ministries, but the people in the White House at that time were not effective. And probably all of you are West Wing supporters.
Well, we are.
West Wing, but you'll see it's really important.
But they had 2 terms at it, didn't they, really? I suppose the thing is they laid the groundwork for Obamacare.
They did.
And generally speaking, if you come in second, you're more likely to be successful. I remember
They
Brian
really
Wolfson saying to me once,
Yeah.
pioneers get arrows in their arses, and that's true.
And they
isn't
really did.
it? Yeah.
And so they had 2 things going for them, and they had a sort of, before the Tea Party movement, but the really right wing of the Republican Party under Newt Gingrich started getting really, really active about that time. And he began to lose because they weren't pushing things through. And so what happened was that they lost Congress, during that first term, and that was catastrophic because, of course, then you couldn't get things through. And in my job, it was very interesting because somebody had said to me, and I wish I could remember who, remember, if you're here on an issue based, you must be bipartisan. You might not want to go and talk to the Republicans because you see all the Democrats here, but be bipartisan. So I duly did that, being a sort of do my homework sort of person. I went to visit Bob Dole, and I went to visit a few other, Orrin Hatch, who's still in the Senate. I went to see Newt Gingrich. And of course, he was nobody who was progressive or on the left or a Democrat really wanted to see because, his policies were pretty awful. But I went.
So
and
this blonde English lady turned up.
And what we were doing, and what we were doing. But what happened was then, never expecting that the Republicans would get Congress. And then when they did, what he'd said was that he wasn't going to talk to anybody he hadn't met when they were in opposition, which meant we were in a fantastic position because we were the only people that met him. And so I thought it was really good advice. So we were then able to work with them to get the summit going and to get what really was some No Child Left Behind Act was what we were aiming for, and that did get through.
Yeah.
And this was about children with disabilities getting some standard support across schools.
And when I know you've written a book about learning disability. And it's a hell of a book. It's 360 odd pages. It's a proper book. It's still on Amazon at the full price. All my books have been remaindered. I'm very pissed off about this, I must say. And it's
I'm amazed to hear that, actually, that it's still being so.
And it's what I like about it is, it really gets under the hood, doesn't it, of learning disability. Where did all that come from?
So
how did you know that stuff?
So here's what I think about how we do things.
Did you ever meet Nan Carl in your travels? No, she's an American expert on learning disability, and she worked for me when I was running a hospital. But learning disability, you're watching learning disability, your thing. What's it called? Something like the learning disability. Your book. What's it called?
Oh, it was called Learning Disabilities: Lifelong Issues.
That's it. Lifelong Issues. A great title. So if learning disability is your thing, go to Amazon now and buy this book now because it's a fantastic book. I'm not sure. Actually, I'm sure. The things have changed since you've written it.
Oh, yeah.
But what I liked about it is that that it moves away from medicalising the care
Yeah.
of people with learning disability, which has always been the big problem. But so come on, where did all this come from?
So we took the view that if you wanted to move policy, you know how we all go to conferences and enjoy them and people speak, and what we wanted to do was to say, well, actually that doesn't work if you really want to change policy. How do we create something that will move things forward? So what we wanted was a blueprint for progress. So that's why we have the research and the policy and the practice, and then what people think about it. And then I had journalists on this. We called it a summit. People only got 10 minutes. We did it under Health and Human Services, employment. We did it under all the different areas. 10 minutes for those people who normally speak for an hour and a half to say, give us the nub of it. And then for the policy people to say, so from the research, what should the policy be? And the policy people, how do you put that in practice? And for then to say, how does that work for you as the mum and dad or the person with a learning disability? And then the journalist to sum up at the end. And that's where the book came from, that was the idea, and that was the background to No Child Left Behind. But we needed to have Republicans and Democrats on side, and we needed to really push the envelope. So it was a sort of, we called it a summit rather than a conference, because the purpose was to try and move the field forward.
I think it's really interesting, and it's a case study in how to do lobbying, isn't it? Which feeds into what you're doing now. I'll come on to more about the public health, but I think your background is so interesting, because then you got moved into dyslexia.
Yes.
Yes, is that
yes,
right? Have I got the chronology right?
Yeah, that's absolutely. When we moved back to the UK.
Yeah, you did.
Yeah,
you
10
did,
years.
You did dyslexia. Yeah.
I did.
And I speak as someone who, as a child, as a kid at school, was just thought of as thick, which is probably right as well. But I struggled.
I think so.
I struggled a lot with reading. I could do the numbers, I couldn't do the reading. It was only later in life when I realised what dyslexia was. You know, I realised why I couldn't do certain things, and I didn't know that I didn't know I couldn't do certain things. That's the thing about dyslexia. You don't really know until everybody takes the piss out of you, and then then it can be very depressing.
It can
very
be
upsetting.
very
And I don't know if you've seen, but I've done a YouTube on it for the Blonde Dyslexia Association.
the BDA or something.
Yeah.
No, it's an organisation that supports students, so diverse learners.
Right.
So I just told them my dyslexia story and told them that don't give a stuff, just do your thing.
I think I felt passionate about it because
But it
so
was
many
difficult.
children
Well,
were written off.
Yeah,
so
when you were
early.
doing it, Shirley, I mean, I'm not quite sure, this must have been, 10 or 15 years ago?
Yeah,
It was very difficult. In a sense, diseases and illnesses and conditions go through fashions, don't they? And it's brutal to talk to them, talk about them in this way, because these are people's lives and their families. But we've had the kind of breast cancer fashion because it was made fashionable by the campaigners, the lobbyists, the awareness of it, and we've had other diseases, that AIDS and HIV. I mean, you look at the fantastic job that the Terence Higgins Trust did, the textbook lobbying, and we'll talk about that as well later on. And somehow or other, dyslexia now it's become kind of topical, isn't it?
I think what's important, we started these award dinners, which were to showcase to young people that actually you could be really successful with dyslexia. And of course lots of people in the arts and architecture are well known, but actually doctors. I mean, one of my favourite stories is about Toby Cosgrove, who as CEO, just stood down as CEO of the Cleveland Clinic. And I lived in Cleveland for a little while and met him. And I was doing learning disabilities, understood a bit about dyslexia and got to know him. And he was running the heart surgery at Cleveland Clinic, and I couldn't understand why he was so interested in what I did, it seemed, compared to what he did. And it turned out, of course, that he was dyslexic. And the only reason that he got into medical school was because he'd been in Vietnam. Otherwise, he wouldn't have made the grades. He has now got 36 patents in heart surgery. When he was practicing in heart surgery, the #1 in the USA, and he was Obama's choice to lead the Veterans Admin. So this is a giant of a man in medicine, and he almost didn't get in because of his dyslexia. And he said to me, I worked twice as hard as everybody else just to get through the course. He said, I can do a 5-hour operation, I look at the heart and it just makes all sense to me, but when I have to call the wife or the family and I look at the name, I think, oh, how do you pronounce that? And I get all panicked.
Yeah, I didn't know I had a problem. I just thought I was stupid and couldn't spell. Most of it manifests in the written word, which is what I do now every day. And a psychiatrist who was working for me in the trust looked at some of the stuff I'd written, and she said, I think you're dyslexic. I didn't know.
Yeah, that would have been pretty common, and that's a problem for so many children, that they aren't diagnosed quickly.
Yeah, I didn't know. It was too late by then. And they tried me with the blue glasses. Did you do blue glasses?
Yeah.
Blue glasses? Yeah, if you're watching, don't bother. Yeah, just go
It
on.
works for some children,
Just
we need to say.
Well, it works for
Not
some
for
people,
Roy,
yeah.
but
No,
for some.
yeah. Yes, other glasses are available. Yeah, it didn't work for me. No, just get on with your life. That was my... get on with it. So that was interesting. So did you achieve anything with that, do you think?
Yeah, I think we did a lot of work with primary schools, so raised actually quite a lot of money, over £1 million, to put in mainstream schools, and it was an evaluated program in primary, training the teaching assistants in how to support children who were being left behind slightly. So the important thing was to get in there early and to support those children. And a lot of that program still remains in some of the schools around that. It's very important that, so that it's a big battle, of course, between phonics and real words. And phonics is hugely important for children with dyslexia.
There was a row about phonics just recently,
Yeah,
wasn't there?
it was an Economist, I think. There was an article, yeah.
And of course dyslexia, we can't get stuck on dyslexia, but it's just in my mind because it affects a lot of student nurses.
Mm-hmm.
And when they knew about me, that's how I got hooked into this. Student nurses had to, you have to make provision for them, and rightly so, in my view. So okay, so you did dyslexia,
10 years,
sorted dyslexia out, and then what?
Well, then actually, it wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and I was asked by a headhunter if I would consider doing an interim role, and I thought, well, I hadn't really thought about that because I travelled a bit. Yes,
wow.
Imagine that. Imagine that.
Headhunter, yeah. Posh.
Imagine.
Yeah.
If I wanted to do an interim role for an adoption or maternity adoption cover. And it was Alzheimer's Research UK. And my mother had just been diagnosed with Alzheimer's.
You've taken on all the easy jobs, haven't you? Yeah.
And I absolutely loved it.
Yeah.
I went in there for
Now,
about
when
8-9
was
months.
this?
So this was 2012.
Again,
And in a very short time.
It was before.
I'm now on the board. So.
Before Alzheimer's got.
Well, it was just as the Dementia Challenge was coming on board.
Yeah.
So it was at that time, and it was sort of, the time had come for Alzheimer's, I think, at that point. And it was very lucky for me to be in there because I got a chance to help get the chairman of Alzheimer's Research UK, who is an amazing chairman, and David Mayhew, who is head at Cazenove.
Yeah.
He's a city fixture, but he's a wonderful guy, and he's been a particularly great chairman around the Dementia Challenge. And
let's just reel this back a bit, because you were with the Alzheimer's Society?
No, Alzheimer's Research UK was for that interim
Yeah,
period.
because I think that's kind of confusing for the public, because actually we're talking about dementia here, aren't we? There are
So-
7 types of dementia, of
Yeah,
which Alzheimer's,
Alzheimer's
is one.
That discussion goes on at Alzheimer's Research UK and the Alzheimer's Society all the time, because whether to say dementia, but actually
Well,
the
it's branding,
public...
because Alzheimer's
the
is a
public-
great word, isn't it?
Well,
Where
that's
the hell did that
exactly
come from?
right. And the public understand that more than they understand some of the other dementias. And actually...
Mr.
Yeah.
Alzheimer's himself was an interesting man, isn't
He
he?
was.
Austrian, I think.
Austrian.
Yeah.
I mean, it's quite interesting that over the last year or two, I'm now on the board of Alzheimer's Research UK, which is a great privilege, to see that that organisation has grown from 5 million to something like 28 million in
Members or
since
pounds?
22 pounds.
All right. Okay, 'cause
Which is for research, so
but,
the money
yeah,
is
but
for
what
research.
the hell have
that's
you
very
done with it? I mean,
important.
what have you done with it? Because, you know, you might as well take all the carers on holiday, really. I mean, that's probably do more good.
Yeah, well-
If you look at, you know, if you look at research, right?
Yeah.
I mean, let's be blunt about this. We've got 800,000 people with dementia, not
Of whom
just-
my mother is one, so
Okay,
yeah.
and there's be a lot of people watching this
Yeah.
that have got it, and a lot of people in this room. We don't have a hint of a cure. We've got Aricept and something else, the
Oh,
name
yeah.
of which I forget,
Mm.
and which is the best we've got,
Yeah,
which is indifferent at best.
Mm.
I don't get sued by a pharmaceutical company, but you know what I mean.
I do.
We've got no hint of a second generation. I mean, if you think about breast
Yeah.
cancer, for example, we had Herceptin, and since that changed the pathways, and then we
Yeah.
had different drugs, and now they're better drugs. We've got Aricept and the drug I can't remember, where there doesn't seem to be any second generation
There isn't.
coming up.
There isn't.
We've got a social services sector which is completely unable
It's
to.
groaning under the stress of this.
And,
it really
and
is.
we're going to have 1 million people with some form of dementia by
So
2025.
let me tell you what's
What are
happening.
you doing?
So let me tell you what's happening in here, because I think you mentioned HIV/AIDS before, and so the model of what research is trying to do now in Alzheimer's is taken from that, which is to say we need the private, the public sector to work together, and the third sector, civil society, to work together, and to be not working in siloed areas. And actually, you know, the pharmaceutical companies often work in very siloed ways, and you can understand why, because you've got to make money from the drugs. But of course, the pharmaceuticals are pulling out of Alzheimer's because of these huge drug trials that are failing. So
I think
under
just
this,
look
they're
at those. I think I'm right in saying that AstraZeneca had a drug that was
Yeah.
did second phase trials in China, I think, and that didn't amount to very much. And there's been another
There's been 3 or 4 over the last couple of years. It's
Failing.
been very, very
just recently.
disappointing.
But it's worth. But I mean, if from the pharmaceuticals company's point of view, we know that a drug for Alzheimer's or dementia would be worth £860 a week, because that's the price of putting someone in the nursing home. We can put a value on it,
Yeah.
multiply that up by 1 million
Yeah.
people by 2025. It's a drug worth going down the mines to find.
Well, that's what we believe. And certainly, if you look at, we think that some of the drugs probably would work well if we could identify earlier who's at risk.
Right,
Because-
GPs don't
no.
want to do that, do they?
Well, here's where the UK is ahead in this, and this is quite interesting. This is the cohort studies of the MRC. So because of the National Health Service, we have the medical research councils have got these cohort studies of various years, and the 1948 cohort study has got data on 5,000 people from the day they were born until their age now, 68 or something. And so they're such a valuable group of people because no other system has that. So there is now, in the middle of a study that UCL are doing, with a cohort of that cohort study, where they're looking at early intervention. They're looking to say, what does it look like, the people that are now cognitively challenged and look like they'll get Alzheimer's or one of the dementias. So take us back. Let's look at all the things that happened to them. And because they've got all the medical stuff as well as all the social things, we ought to be able to draw some inferences around that. And if we can do that, then trying some of the drugs that already exist earlier, a lot of the researchers think might work. So that's one area that's being looked at.
And are there any early signs of hope? Or
Well, there are. I think what's good about the new ways of working, so where internationally researchers are working jointly on this, is they're looking at different hypotheses. So we've had the hypotheses, as you know, of amyloid, which is the sort of tarry, treacly bit in the brain. They're looking at different kinds of hypotheses as well. So they've got several different strings that they're looking at in this area of research, which they didn't have before.
But
it's a challenge.
It's a kind of national emergency.
It is,
isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It's a kind of. I mean, unless we try and fix this, we'll get swamped.
That's absolutely true. I mean, people are more frightened of dementia than they are of cancer now, and that does tell you something. So